Welcome, everyone. Very glad to welcome Maurice FitzGerald, the illustrious CX historian, author of several books on NPS and customer experience, and now my colleague at OCX Cognition. And today, Maurice is going to be reviewing the most recent book by Fred Reichheld, together with Darci Darnell and Maureen Burns of Bain & Company, which has been titled Winning on Purpose, The Unbeatable Strategy of Loving Customers. Maurice, thanks very much for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Richard. It's going to be an entertaining discussion, I think.
I hope so. So you titled your book, or the review of the book, I should say, Fred Reichheld is Dreaming the Impossible Dream. And I'd like to hear why you think that's an impossible dream, but perhaps you could start by giving a quick overview for listeners of Fred's key talking points he makes in the book.
Okay, well, I'll try and get the music out of my head while I do that. I guess there's four main things. One, he starts by reassessing his customer experience legacy. He's working to deepen it, really to get into fine detail about what he feels he's achieved and what he thinks he's failed at. Some of that's driven by, I feel, the cancer therapy he was undergoing while writing the book. He states that while NPS is extremely powerful, is the best single question metric that we've got, and of course Fred co-created it, he feels that it's almost never used correctly, and that's why its impact is far less than what he had hoped. He goes on to say that he believes that all companies' central organizing principle and strategy should be built around the golden rule, the rule of loving customers as much as you love your own people, loving customers as much as you love your company. That should be the key to success. Now, he believes that doing that involves eliminating short-term thinking, which is quite difficult to do. And finally, the main other thing he does is he introduces a new meta metric, a new compound metric called earned growth rate, which is built on two other metrics, and he believes that that should be put into place as one of the core elements of taking short-termism out of the picture.
All so far so good. I mean, some new ideas there, but also a lot of ideas that aren't exactly new in the CX industry. How do you come to the belief then from that this is, as you might say, dreaming the impossible dream? And more specifically, I mean, what parts of that are impossible?
Right. I mean, I guess I was influenced by the book that I read just before reading the new book. I read Naomi Klein's book called This Changes Everything, which is about climate change and how to address it and what needs to be done. Now, both Naomi Klein and Fred Reichheld come to the same conclusion, which is that fundamental change requires us to eliminate and replace the current modern capitalist system, being the shareholder-based capitalist system. Klein believes that it requires that having far less CO2 requires people essentially having less money to spend, and that capitalism in the current system causes them to have loads of money to spend. Fred believes that the current capitalist system causes short-termism and the desire to produce results every week, every quarter, and so on, and that we have to eliminate that to be able to take proper care of customers, just like you have to believe that your personal relationships, your deepest personal relationships, are things that you can only modify really in the medium term. And it just takes work over a long period of time. Now, my belief that it's a dream is simply because I don't believe that Klein or Reichheld's vision can be achieved, that there just isn't enough motivation on the planet to eliminate the current capitalist system.
Perhaps a rather depressing thought, but well, let's do what you might argue most of the world does: leave climate change aside for just the moment. You and I have both had the opportunity to work with Fred and many others at Bain over the years, and I think we do share an admiration for what's been accomplished, and you could make a pretty convincing argument that nobody has accomplished more to get customer experience on the agenda of large corporations than Fred Reichheld. So perhaps before we talk too critically about it, perhaps you could share a few thoughts on what did impress you about the book.
Well, I know Fred worked with all of the people that you knew and managed at Satmetrics, in particular, of course, Dr. Laura Brooks, in the creation of NPS. This whole capacity for self-reflection was really amazing, and I found his analysis of the failures of NPS and the system around it, Bain's own net promoter system to bring the expected results, to be really excellent. Yeah. So you used in your comments, and I read your piece on this, what I think you referred to as the change equation as the backbone of your book review, and used that as a framework for arguing that the earned growth rate concept is in of itself impossible, or at the very least very unlikely to be implemented. Why is that? Well, here's what the change equation discussion is about. It's what I believe is that for any meaningful change to take place, four things have to be in existence. Most obviously, people have to be dissatisfied with the current state of affairs. If you're not unhappy, why bother changing? We have the experience with talking to some people in some companies, some CX leaders, where we can say to them, what do you think of this way of doing things? And they say, well, yeah, that looks really good, but hey, what I'm doing right now is just fine. So you need to be sufficiently dissatisfied with the current state to embrace change. Second, you have to have a clear vision of the future. And clarity means that it's easy to communicate. Third, you have to have clear, practical, short-term first steps that can be taken along the path towards that vision. And of course, fourth, the whole thing has got to be worth the effort. So that's the change equation in brief.
So you apply that to the book, and you think that's problematic?
Well, unfortunately, I think all four elements of the change equation are problematic. Let's just start with the first one. Fred states quite strongly that he believes that, and he chooses American citizens as the reference for this. He believes that they have growing dissatisfaction with the current capitalist system. The issue is that he cites a Gallup survey, a Gallup poll that's been done for many years, and he cites the 2018 results, so 4 years ago. And in 2018, and only in 2018, there was a dip in satisfaction with the capitalist system. That dip has gone away in the two surveys that have been done since then. There just isn't a broad dissatisfaction with the current capitalist system. Yes, of course, there will always be the 10 or 20% of the population who are dissatisfied and will move, but it's not a broadly held belief by the majority of U.S. citizens. Yeah.
So I think that obviously begs the question whether or not there's a better alternative, even if people are dissatisfied. But there's other aspects of the model, I think, beyond just this notion that you have to be dissatisfied with the system. Do you find that those aren't well supported either?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's talk about the clarity of the future vision. Now, Fred does something wonderful that I love to illustrate and to show us what the future vision is about, which is he tells stories about individual companies and he uses them as examples. And uses them as the examples to follow of showing customers the love that they need and getting the financial returns and shareholder returns that you should get from doing that. And he uses as a counterexample the Jim Collins book, Good to Great. And he says, here's the proof that the old capitalist system doesn't work. In Collins' book, he picks 11 companies and works through them as examples of how they went from good to great. And as Fred correctly points out, the book was written in 2001, but where are they now? And the answer is that 8 of the 11 have performed far worse than the S&P average. So fine, we accept that. So the good to great vision espoused by Collins and promoted that way didn't work out as expected. But how are Fred's examples doing? He picks 4 companies, which are Warby Parker, Chewy, who I think you have used for your dog's pet food, Peloton, and Airbnb as the primary examples of 4 companies that are absolutely what everybody should emulate. The problem with that as a vision, as a clear vision, is that all 4 of them have had really pretty disastrous stock market performance since he wrote the book. So he's fallen into the same trap that Collins did. And Collins picked as examples companies that wound up not performing the way that he expected. And Fred and his co-authors have picked companies that have also had really poor stock market performance compared to the S&P average. Now, since that's what you're using to create the vision, and it doesn't work, then the vision isn't clear.
Yeah, I think it's awfully risky pinning your argument on the basis of stock performance, because as you illustrate, great companies can suffer real setbacks in stock performance. And it seems to me like the mistake is justifying any theory on the basis of, oh, look, this company's done really well in the stock market over the last 12 months, because you're setting yourself up for the obvious fall. I'm not sure anyone's arguing that Warby Parker, Peloton, Airbnb aren't necessarily great companies, and there are probably some great lessons to learn about how to manage the customers. But the stock argument, almost inevitably, it comes back to bite you. When Fred talks about more practical ways in which he thinks he's going to achieve the vision, what else does he talk about there in those regards?
Yeah, and this is where we get into another issue. As you know, CEOs who are sponsoring a major change want to see some evidence that things are moving in the direction of that change. They want it monthly or quarterly at the very least. The catch with the first steps that Fred and co-authors outline as being absolutely essential to the change is, well, it requires that the people who administer the generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, agree on a definition for the earned growth rate and that they put it into the GAAP standards. That's not going to happen in a single quarter. That's going to take years. And the second part is it requires all companies to implement customer-specific accounting. Now, customer-specific accounting can be really expensive to do. It was one of these things when HP merged with EDS, and I was in charge of the merger in EMEA at that time. EDS did have customer-specific accounting and HP didn't. And when we compared the costs of them, the many millions that it cost to do the customer-specific accounting meant that we eliminated it. We just didn't feel that the benefit was great enough. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm certain that there will be a minority of companies that will embrace it and do it, even for all of the customers. And companies that have got a small number of large customers should find it actually relatively easy to do. But if you've got thousands of customers and you've got to implement customer-specific accounting for every one of them, that's really challenging and really expensive.
Right.
I think I would have liked to keep it in HP, but it was just too hard to justify. It just wasn't worth the effort of doing it.
On the whole argument for getting GAAP standards adjusted, I know this has been a frequent idea that Fred has suggested, not just this time with earned growth rate, but also in the past. And it just seems to me like if the market sees value, if investors see value in measuring businesses through a certain lens, and he makes an argument for net recurring revenue, which is part of the earned growth calculation, and the net recurring revenue has been widely adopted, as you know, by private equity and venture capitalists, and nobody from the government came along and said, oh, you have to measure it this way. And in fact, you could argue that it was much more effective because it was adopted by industry. So I'm not sure I see the compelling case for a government mandate. And in fact, I suppose you can make counter arguments. You look at ESG reporting and say, well, that's been kind of soft, but nevertheless, the market is trying to find a solution for that. So I don't see the government argument for getting involved. If it's a great way to measure companies, surely it'll happen anyway.
I mean, you may well be right, particularly as you correctly say, you see VCs and other types of investment bodies using net recurring revenue in their analytics, though they may not all define it exactly the same way, but it doesn't really matter all that much for their particular purposes of deciding on investing or not. The last thing that Fred was suggesting, I think, was customer lifetime value, that there should be standardization of it, but he's also correctly pointed out that in quarterly reports, people have been reporting NPS numbers without saying where they came from. And you and I have seen enough of these to know that some of them are just pure rubbish and some of them are perfectly honest. And then we've also listened to more than one quarterly call where a CEO talks about it and clearly doesn't know what they're talking about when they're mentioning the NPS
and we'll let
number.
the market sort that out, right? At the end of the day, investors are well informed. Analysts cover these companies. You think they'll figure it out. What are your outlines of solution then, having read the book, that you think are practical?
Well, I think that there's the key to being practical is being operational, and introducing another high-level meta metric is taking us further away from the operational realities. And now, how could we build on operational things and the net recurring revenue aspects to try and make everybody love their customers? That's not that obvious to me. But the more that we can determine and use operational data to predict NPS, to predict net recurring revenue, to predict customer lifetime values, the more credible the work of the customer experience leaders are going to be. So I don't like phrasing the problem as being capitalism. I far prefer thinking about it as getting churn surprises, getting the account manager goes into their largest customer and 3 months before contract renewal and discovers to their surprise that the customer has just signed with their biggest competitor, and the account manager saying, but they never said anything to me. So how could I possibly know anything was going on? But from the operational data, maybe even from the Salesforce data, where you discover the account manager hasn't been speaking very much to the customer, you can predict it, and you can eliminate the surprises. I'm far more motivated to eliminate the surprises that are part of the current way that we've implemented NPS and across the planet than I am in changing capitalism.
Yeah, and I think we both agree with that, and also the sort of exhaustion of the survey-based model, which just feels kind of worn out now. I really felt like it was a great thing to draw attention to net recurring revenue. I think remind people that there is a quantifiable, if not very hard to quantify, benefit associated with word of mouth, and but anything that gets, especially outside, I think, private equity or B2B SaaS, anything that gets leaders understanding that they should be measuring and thinking in terms of those economic measures, I think is a good thing.
Absolutely.
I read your review. I know we've talked about this. Despite the criticism, you did enjoy the book, and I think that, like all the work that Fred's done, it's exceptionally well written, it's well researched. It's very thoughtful. It's hard to come up with original ideas, right? It's easy to criticize, but it's difficult to advance any sort of new set of ideas. And a lot of business books don't come anywhere close to the standard that Fred sets for himself when he writes these. So perhaps you could sort of wrap this up with a summary on what you took away from it, and what you think that anyone who does choose to read the book would expect to gain from reading it.
Sure. And I couldn't help thinking of one of the few, maybe it's even the only Swiss management metaphor that we've got, and it's a mountain guide metaphor. And if you've ever gone walking or hiking in the mountains with or without snow with a guide, you'll recognize the stages. Think of Fred as the guide. When he wrote The Loyalty Effect way back when, he was pointing out the customer experience mountain, and he was helping us to, grouping us around him to start looking at that and start advancing up the slopes. Publishing the one number you need to grow as a result of the work together with set metrics was the next step. Wow, people are getting really enthusiastic about following up the mountain, and really treating him as the reference point, and we absolutely want to follow this guy up the mountain. Now, in the intervening years, what happened is, Fred, Rob, perhaps also you and me, we were still encouraging the group to go up the mountain, but there were a lot of problems in the way that we all collectively went about implementing all of the things, and the group that we expected to follow started to fall behind a bit. And this is something you see with mountain guides, is sometimes to get the group to speed up, they'll start to go a bit ahead. Now what we see with the latest book is, unfortunately, what happens with mountain guides when the guide gets too far ahead of the group. This vision of putting aside capitalism as the method of solving all of the problems, it's too far, it's too much of a leap, and the group, I believe, will no longer follow Fred up this mountain. They'll just halt and stay where they are unless another guide can come along with a few steps that are just in front of them, rather than an impossible dream way up at the peak.
Yeah, and maybe that's a result of disappointment, as you say. And I think disappointment misplaced. I look around today, and I think the number of companies that have made the customer, if not the center of their business, a very instrumental element in making decisions. If you look at the growth of developed economies, if you look at the level of service we all get today, quite honestly, I think that the results speak for themselves. And I think measurements of CX and Net Promoter Scores played a huge role in bringing the level of thinking around this to a lot of companies. I think there's a risk of trying to make great the enemy of good. And yes, it's good to push new ideas out there, and I think these are good ideas, and I would encourage anyone to read about earned growth and critique it, and maybe use some of the core ideas to get your own leadership understanding the potential for the business if they can really focus on a metric like net revenue retention and put it as a primary way of thinking about creating value for shareholders. I think that's a really good thing. I don't think we need to be as disappointed with the progress because it's not been as perfect as we'd like it. And I think the baby definitely doesn't go out with the bathwater. I think it is capitalism that has actually made customers at the center of things. I think at the end of the day, the capitalist system works really, really well in that regard. You could argue maybe not as well for the environment or maybe not as well for employees, but it sure as heck puts the customer at the center of the universe. Maurice, that's terrific. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts on this book. I hope people do get a chance to read it and perhaps share with us their own observations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I definitely would recommend it. I read it entirely in a single day, and I'm sure others will love it too.
Give it a 9 on an 11-point scale. Thanks very much.